Welcome to our sixth Power to the People webinar. Tonight's webinar is The Power of Voting, the Electoral College, Gerrymandering, and Suppression. My name is Mark Gage. I'm the Director of Publishing for the Center for Civic Education, and I'll be serving as the facilitator of this event. The webinar will last about an hour and a half until 9 p.m. Eastern. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll get to as many as possible. You can also put them in the chat. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. Our sponsors of Power to the People are the Center for Civic Education, Kansas State University, the Johnson County First Amendment Foundation, and the Indiana Bar Foundation. Thank you, sponsors. We could never hold this event without you, so we appreciate your support. And now our moderators are Robert S. Lemming, Director of the We the People programs for the Center for Civic Education, and Thomas Vance, Director of the Center for Social Studies Education at Kansas State University. And I'll turn it over to Robert S. Lemming for a few words. Bob.
Welcome, everybody. This is my 13th election coming up next week, a presidential election. I was part of the group that voted in 1972 as 18-year-olds. And I can remember sitting there with my parents filling out our absentee ballots because we were living in New York and we were voting in Indiana's election. That I was doing something, one, that younger people hadn't had a chance to do, but more importantly, this was something that most people in history never had the opportunity to exercise their power by deciding their leadership. I felt awed by that and a responsibility to pay attention. I'm sure I didn't pay much of attention when I was 18, but as years went on. And I decided that I would look at voting from the two sort of first principles of the political philosophies of classical republicanism and natural rights philosophy, meaning that what my vote mattered would be based on what I thought the common good might want and also my self-interest. And ultimately, if I can get to where Madison was in terms of enlightened self-interest, that might even be better. I've had now 13 times to try that out. And we have a big election coming up. Obviously, this was timed for that. So I'm just happy that everybody's on, and I can't wait to hear what Professor Lee has to say about this, and I'll turn it over to Tommy for now.
I just want to welcome everyone and say that I'm looking forward to this as well. You know, Lemming has been through many, many more elections than I have because he's so much older than I am. But I will say that in my limited experience, I can't remember an election where there was so much debate about our process itself, our election process itself, right? On one side, we have people claiming voter fraud in various ways. And on the other side, we have people claiming voter suppression in a variety of different ways and formats. And there are just a whole bunch of issues that emanate from, of all things, how we do elections. You know, I can't believe that that it's come to this, but it has. So I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you again for coming to our webinar. We've just really, I've just enjoyed every one of them. I'm looking forward to Michael's presentation, and I'll turn it over to you, Mark.
All right, thank you so much for that. And let me just introduce our scholar, Professor Michael Lee. Michael Lee serves as senior counsel in the democracy program for the Brennan Center for Justice, where his work focuses on redistricting, voting rights, and elections. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, Lee practiced law at Baker Botts LLP in Dallas for 10 years. He was the author of a widely cited blog on redistricting and election law issues that the New York Times called indispensable. He is a regular writer and commentator on election law issues, appearing on PBS NewsHour, MSNBC, NPR, and in print at the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and USA Today, among others. In addition to his election law work, Lee previously served as executive director of B1 Texas, a donor alliance that supported nonprofit organizations working to increase voter participation and engagement in historically disadvantaged African American and Hispanic communities in Texas. Lee received his JD with honors from Tulane Law School and an undergraduate degree in history from the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome, Professor Lee, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me tonight. And I want to, this talk couldn't be more timely, and it's great to be here to talk about some of the issues that are current and that you're likely to hear about, not only in the classroom, but also around the dining table and on social media and just on the street. And the interesting thing is that, this presentation, I've done several versions of this presentation, but it is very different than the one that I would have done even a few weeks ago, and that just because of how everything has evolved. What we're worried about at a given moment, what seems to be the thing that could upset the election or create a problem, is there, and then it goes away, and then we worry about something else. And so I'm going to talk about three issues today: the Electoral College, gerrymandering and redistricting, and then voter suppression. But I also want to leave ample time to hear from you guys, because there's lots of things that are on the news and that you're hearing about and that we should be talking about and that would be interesting to talk about. In fact, there may be some things that happened just today that we should be talking about. But I want to talk about three things that sort of frame where our democracy is today and where what some of the challenges are and where we might go. And first up, I want to start with the Electoral College, because I think, every presidential year we have a lot of debate about the Electoral College, more so perhaps this year than others. And I think a good place to start on the Electoral College is just to note how much of an outlier the US is in having an Electoral College for picking president. Because there aren't many places that have anything remotely equivalent. Now, there are places that have indirect election of the head of state, where Parliament elects the head of state, or where officials from various parts of the government, the national government, the state government, and local governments come together in a form of electoral college to elect the president. Pakistan is one example, Madagascar is another. But those are actual elected officials who, have a day job being a city councilor or being a member of a state assembly or national government, who come together and vote on who the head of state should be. We do it differently here. We actually elect the people who have one job and one job only, which is to go to their state capital in December and vote for somebody to be president of the United States. And that's a little bit weird, right? I mean, I think we have to recognize that is a little bit of an outlier. And when I talk to reporters from around the world, they find it almost inexplicable. Why do you do it this way? And we'll get into a little bit of why we do it this way. But it is just a note of, a little bit of at least an outlier. And it's also an outlier in the sense that not only do we elect the electors who have this one very distinct job, but we do so on a statewide basis in a winner-take-all system, right? So in other words, the person who gets all of Texas's 38 electoral votes is determined by who wins Texas. So even if a candidate wins only by 10 votes, even by one vote, just one vote, they get all of the 38 electoral votes, right? We don't sort of allocate them proportionally. We don't have districts drawn for electing electors. It's winner take all. And that itself creates some of the tension with the Electoral College, because I'm in upstate New York right now, where there are a lot of Republicans, but because of New York City, New York will be a Democratic state, and really, like, all these Republican votes in upstate New York don't sort of matter, right? And you can think of some other places where Democratic votes don't matter, and so that's another oddity of the Electoral College. And it is in a lot of ways very at odds with how we think about elections in general, in the modern view at least. We think about everybody's vote being equal, and the person who wins the most votes wins the election. That's certainly how it is for every other election that we vote in. It's not the case for the Electoral College. In fact, in recent decades, we've had at least two examples of the person who becoming president who did not win the electoral vote, Donald Trump, and then George W. Bush. And so, just in our lifetime, there have been two examples of somebody who didn't win the popular vote, nonetheless becoming president. And so, from the standpoint of 2020, at least, it can be fairly hard to defend the Electoral College. I'll do a little bit of that later on, but it can be hard to defend it. And that said, I do think, like, when we look back, it probably did make some sense at the country's founding, almost 250 years ago. After all, back then, there was no federal government capable of running a national election. In addition, the situation in the states differed widely. Even back in the early republic, Rhode Island was a really small state and not hard to get around and not hard to sort of like figure out. Virginia and other states were much larger, especially if you consider, and much more rural and much more frontier, especially when you consider that many of the early states had these extensive land claims that stretched across the Appalachians. And so they were like gigantic states, even larger than they were now. And the idea that somehow you were going to like figure out what the rules for an election would be nationally, and then to have the wherewithal to actually administer those rules just seemed probably unthinkable to the framers of the Constitution. And so they made the decision that, like, hey, the local people will know best. Do you need 10 days of voting? Do you need, or is 5 days of voting enough? Do you need a month of voting? It probably made a lot of sense. Like, let's just leave it to the states, and the states will decide. Now, at the time, of course, it probably also didn't hurt. I think we have to be honest in talking about the Electoral College, that one of its appeals to at least some of the states was that it gave more power to the southern states, right? Because the electoral votes then, as now, is determined not by the number of voters in a state, but by the population of states. And at that time, it was determined by including slaves, or at least 3/5 of slaves in there. And so southern states, even though they had a relatively small number of voters, actually had a lot of political power. And it's perhaps not surprising then that Virginia comes to dominate presidential elections in the early part of our country's history. There's at least, you can kind of see where the Electoral College comes from historically. But again, from the standpoint of 2020, it can, not only is it an anomaly internationally, but it also can be hard to defend sort of on other grounds, right? And in 2020, in particular, we've seen how the Electoral College can play out in horrifically bad ways by making some votes matter more in the minds of politicians than others. Namely, your vote will matter a lot more if you happen to live in one of a handful of swing states. And to be clear, this is not something that is new. It's not something that is limited to Republicans or Democrats. It's something that politicians across the political spectrum have been guilty of. But in 2020, this problem has gotten a vivid illustration with President Trump's sometimes dismissive comments about the pandemic and pandemic-related needs of what he has called blue states, right? And it's by contrast, it's not hard to imagine if, for example, the Republican votes in upstate New York mattered. The president probably would be more concerned about getting aid to New York or California. So we've seen like the real world effects when, like, the only votes that really matter are like if you live in Florida or Arizona, and not most of most of the country. And so now, having said that, I do want to at least talk about a couple of well, one positive of the Electoral College, which many times people talk about, like, voters are the only thing that matters, right? And we should, it should be one person, one vote, and that's how we should do it. There is some advantage in the Electoral College in the sense that the weight of the states is determined by including everyone, and it's determined by including children. It's determined including immigrants. It's determined, by people who don't have the right to vote for one reason or the other. And that can be good because these are people who are parts of our community, right? And so that is at least one advantage. I said I would try to defend the Electoral College some, and that's the one that sort of jumps out to me. The other thing I will say, that you oftentimes hear when people talk about the Electoral College is this criticism that it gives small states too much power. And I don't think that actually is right. What I think the Electoral College does is it gives states that are electorally competitive a lot of power. And that's true whether they're large or small. And so if Texas or California were competitive, they would be the center of our electoral universe, in the same way that in times New Hampshire is, or Ohio used to be, or that Florida is seemingly in every election. There, people have lots of feelings about the Electoral College. I'm sure we'll hear some about that in the questioning. It's a complicated subject. Now, some people have suggested that we should fix the Electoral College. We should change it. And I want to go through a couple of options that people have proposed, because I think, we're starting to have a lot of conversation about that, particularly, with this election. And one of the leading options right now is something called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is a mouthful, but that's an agreement among states that would go into effect only when enough states have joined so that you get to at least 270 electoral votes. And what the compact provides is that states who are members would award their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote, even if the people in that state didn't vote for the winner of the national popular vote. And because you have at least 270 members, that would be enough to determine the result of the election. So if a Republican won the national popular vote, California, which is a member of the Interstate Compact, would choose Republican electors, and those would vote for the winner of the national popular vote, even though California is unlikely to have voted for that candidate, at least in the present circumstances. And the states who are the compact is something that is possible because the Constitution provides in Article 2 that the state legislatures of the states get to pick the electors however they want. And states have opted to have elections for choosing electors, but the Constitution doesn't require them to do that. They could just as easily say we are picking our electors based on who won the national popular vote and do it in that way. And so they could that's something that a lot of people have pushed. Right now, 15 states plus the District of Columbia have joined the compact, which gets you to about 196 electoral votes. In addition, there are about 3 or 4 states that would get you to around 256 electoral votes, so still not quite enough. But there is at least some momentum there. But most of the states that have joined so far are Democratic states, and I do think like some of the hard, they've gotten all the easy targets, right? Like New York and California. There is a perception, at least, that the Electoral College, there's a perception among many Republicans that the Electoral College right now favors Republicans, and therefore, why would they want to enter into a national compact that could favor Democrats, right? That the Democrats will always win the national popular vote. It's not clear to me that that's true over time. In fact, if you look over the course of our country's history, there is not necessarily a clear favoritism for one party or the other in the Electoral College. It goes back and forth, and likewise the national popular vote. And so, that could, but I think people oftentimes look at their short-term interest, and in the short term, at least, many Republican states have concluded that they would be better off with the Electoral College. I do think it is very interesting because we could be at a really interesting point in this debate, in this election, because Texas seems to be in play this year in ways that it hasn't been before. And Texas right now has 38 electoral votes after the next, in the next election, it will have 41 with the adjustments after the census. And if Texas moves into the Democratic column or is even competitive, it is really impossible for Republicans to put together a map to win the presidency, to get to 270 electoral votes without Texas, right? Because you could lose, as Democrats, you could lose Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and it wouldn't matter if you have Texas, right? With its 41, soon to be 41 electoral votes. And so I think a lot of Republican views on the Electoral College may be about to shift. On the other hand, I suppose some Democratic views on the Electoral College might shift back the other way, right? Right now, Democrats tend to be the ones who don't like the Electoral College, but they might suddenly find if Texas is in their column that they actually do kind of like the Electoral College. So, but we are potentially at an interesting inflection point where something actually might get done, because we're one of those rare moments where there could be a realignment, and that creates some interesting potential. Short of the national popular vote interstate compact, there are at least a few other options for how we might change the Electoral College. And again, remembering that under the Constitution, states have broad leeway in terms of how they choose electors. There's nothing that requires them to do a winner take all. You win the state by one vote, you get all the electors system. And in fact, states could choose to allocate their electors proportionally. So if you get 45% of the vote in New York, you get 45% of the electors. Or they could choose to allocate them by congressional district, which two states, Maine and Nebraska, already do. And that would be perfectly fine. I think the first, doing it proportionally has, a little bit more advantage. It would be, it's not, the congressional districts sometimes are gerrymandered. And so if you did it by congressional district, you'd have an incentive to gerrymander, not only because you would win the congressional seat, but you could also win the electoral vote. But doing it proportionally certainly has some advantage in if a state wanted to get attention, if it felt like, hey, nobody's paying attention to, I don't know, California, right? Like all California has to do is say we're going to allocate our electoral votes proportionally, and Republicans get 40% of the vote in California, and they could get 40% of the electoral vote from California. And so that could be something that, again, states could choose to do. Having said that, I do think that as we think about recreating a national, a more democratic small d system for electing president, we also have to think about some of the other things that come with that, right? Because we really at this point don't have a national election. Who gets to vote varies greatly from state to state. So in some states you can vote even if you're in prison. In other states you lose that right until you come off probation. In some states you can vote for federal elections for 46 days before an election, like in Minnesota. In other states like Connecticut, there is no early voting at all. In some states, there is automatic voter registration or a variant of it. Or at least you can register to vote online really easily. In other states, like my old home state of Texas, to register to vote, you have to print out a paper form or get a paper form and mail it back in. And then some, those are just a few prominent examples. Every election, and as I will do this year, I help with staff election protection hotlines. And one of the big issues that always comes up in these election protection hotlines is somebody saying, hey, I moved last summer across the county line, but I forgot to change my voter registration. Can I still vote? And in some states, the answer is yes, you can. And in Wisconsin, for example, there's same day registration, so you just show up at the new polling place and you register to vote. In other places, there are rules like even if you've moved, you can still vote. But in other places, if you don't do it within 30 days of moving, your registration expires in the old county and you're not registered in the new county and you're out of luck. And so, and those sometimes are strict deadlines. And, every year we have to tell people like, hey, you're out of luck. So as we think about the Electoral College, we also need to think about whether we need more national rules, at least. And at least when you're talking about national rules, that's something that Congress can fix, because although the framers left the power to regulate federal elections to the states in the first instance, the Constitution provides that Congress can step in to override state law and to pass uniform laws, which is something that Congress has done for a long time. For example, in 1845, it passed a law saying the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November is election day. And we have election day coming up in 4 days because of a law that Congress passed in 1845. More recently, Congress passed the National Voter Registration Act to unify and to make voter registration laws a little bit more uniform. And so Congress has a lot of power to create some uniform rules. And so that's something I think that we should definitely keep on the table. Now, I've talked a lot about this election, and we're all focused on the election that happens a little over 4 days from now. But right after that, something else happens, and I want to, and then there's going to be a really quick pivot to that, and I want to talk about that because it will be something that determines how power is allocated for the balance of this decade, and that thing is redistricting. And redistricting is a process of redrawing legislative and congressional and local government district boundaries every 10 years, something that takes place after the census. This year will be a bit different because, as many people will know, the census has been delayed. The Bureau was not able to get people out in the field to do the door knocking until the end of the summer. They normally would have started in, April, May. But it was delayed by several months. That in turn has delayed completion of the census and will delay getting out of the redistricting data until likely next summer, so the summer of 2021. So in the fall of next year, all of these district lines will be redrawn. And in most of the country, it will be lawmakers who actually draw the districts, in other words, state legislatures that draw both legislative districts and congressional districts. And unfortunately, that is a process that is rife for abuse, especially when one party controls the whole of the government. They control both houses of the state legislature and the governor's mansion. And what happens then, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, is they go to town and they draw the map starting with one thing in mind, which is, what does this do for my political party? And that is the paramount thing. And in recent years, we've seen a proliferation of what has been called extreme gerrymandering. And that's something that is getting easier and easier to do with the advent of technology and big data. And what has resulted is that in states that are 50-50, that are to this day battlegrounds like North Carolina and Pennsylvania and Michigan, you end up with wildly skewed maps. So using North Carolina as an example, it's a 50-50 state, and yet the congressional map that was drawn in 2011 allocated 10 of the state's congressional districts to Republicans out of the 13. So it's created a 10-3 map. Similarly, in Pennsylvania, there was a 13-5 map in a state, again, that is 50-50 and evenly divided. And it will probably surprise no one to learn that, the way that you do these gerrymanders, it's oftentimes communities of color, people of color who are targeted, right? Because it's, whether, turning up or down the percentage of non-white people in a district determines how basically Democratic or Republican a district is. And because we continue to have residential segregation in our country, it's very easy to like say, oh, we'll slice off 10% of this Black neighborhood, or let's increase it to like 25%, or let's put all of the Black neighborhood in this district because we're trying to achieve a particular result. And so, that can have the effect of diluting the power of communities of color. And it's something that both Democrats and Republicans have been guilty of. And as I said, the potential for this is becoming much worse in the future because of big data and technology. It used to be that you gerrymandering was a very crude thing. You had like some data, but you didn't have a lot, and you couldn't, maybe you could draw 3 or 4 or 5 alternative maps, and you would pick the best out of 3 or 4 or 5 alternative maps that you have. But now with computers and with much more robust data, you can draw tens of thousands of maps and pick the best out of the tens of thousands. And you also have more data that is layered on about every single voter. And this is based on consumer data and other sorts of modeling. And so it's based on the same sort of stuff that companies use to target you, or that political campaigns use to target you. And so, they can build these complicated models based on what kind of car you drive, what your credit score is, all kinds of what magazines you subscribe to, where you went to college, whether you went to college, and all kinds of information. And when they do this, they can create this like pretty sophisticated guess at like, are you Democrat or Republican? Are you a strong Democrat or a strong Republican? How strong and how likely you are to vote. And so typically political campaigns, if you ever worked on a political campaign, nowadays they have 2 scores. They have a support score and a propensity score. And the support score is like how likely you are to support whichever campaign is trying to measure this. And then the second is how likely you are to turn out. Are you a low propensity, high propensity, middle propensity voter? And so, with that data and using similar sorts of data for redistricting, you can artfully go through and slice and dice communities and recombine them into districts that perform for the course of a decade, right? It used to be that you would do these gerrymanders and they would collapse after an election cycle or 2 because you didn't have enough to be able to like make them stick, and people move around and things change, and you were making educated guesses but without a lot of data. But now, because of this data, what we're seeing with these gerrymanders in places like North Carolina is that they stick for the whole of the decade, right? They produce you might lose a seat or 2 here or there, but you basically have the map intact for the whole of the decade. And you're basically, by controlling redistricting in a year ending in 1, the year after the census, you're able to determine the result for the whole of the decade. And that's anathema. That's contrary to the framers' vision of democracy. John Adams famously talked about how state legislatures, how Congress should be an exact portrait, a miniature of the people as a whole. And that, after all, is why we have elections every 2 years, much more regularly than other countries. In Britain, elections are every 5 years. In other countries, the elections are every 4 years. We have elections every 2 years because the framers thought that as the mood of the people changes, the composition of Congress, the composition of legislature should change. And when you do this kind of gerrymandering, you kind of lock in these extreme maps, a 10-3 map in North Carolina, which is a 50-50 state, and you make it stick for the whole of the decade, you're really rendering all of these elections meaningless. And, I think that has helped fuel a lot of cynicism about the political process, the idea that my vote really doesn't matter, when you have these sort of undemocratic small d processes. Now, the good news on this front is that voters are mad about this, and they are taking action, and increasingly lawmakers too. And it's really important to stress like how big a change that is from just even 15 years ago. Because if you look at polling, when people were trying to do redistricting reform, put things on the ballot, 15 years ago, redistricting was an issue that made people's eyes glaze over. It was gerrymandering even was an issue that they'd never heard of the term. It didn't resonate with them, even if they had heard of it. There has been a sea change since then. And a lot has to do with the extreme gerrymandering that took place after 2010. But also, I think people increasingly see that redistricting abuses have something to do with the fact that government is broken, and we really sort of are in a pitchfork moment on that, right? And so, since 2011, a record 6 states have passed some form of redistricting reform. They may be joined by a 7th, Virginia, on November 3rd. And all of the reforms so far have passed by bipartisan margins. And Michigan is a great example of that. It was a completely grassroots campaign started by people many of whom had never really been involved with politics, had never worked on a campaign at all before. And people nationally were deeply cynical about the prospect of Michigan, right? People said, these fancy salons in New York, all these, the foundations who normally fund all this stuff, this is not going to work out because Michigan is where good ideas go to die. People are too divided. There's too much infighting, even among good government groups and communities of color. They can't get it together, and yet this campaign that started with no money, right? They like zero money. Managed to put together something that collected hundreds of thousands of signatures, put it on the ballot, and win. They were so poor at one point they actually had like volunteers like make clipboards. Like there was a volunteer who was a woodcutter, and he would like make clipboards for them because they had no money for clipboards. And he had nothing. He was not a good canvasser, right? But he could make clipboards. So, and that really is one of the most inspiring stories of the last few years. And what people will tell you who worked on that campaign and worked on similar campaigns in places like Ohio is that when they went door to door to collect these signatures, they would go in very mixed partisan neighborhoods. They would knock on doors where Democrats lived, they would knock on doors where Republicans lived, and everybody was ready to sign. They would just say, hey, we're trying to take power away from the hands of politicians, and people would be like, give me the pen. And I think that tells you something that even though many of our elected leaders are very cynical and power hungry, voters are angry about this, and so again, a record 6 and potentially 7 states have passed some form of redistricting reform, and increasingly even lawmakers are starting to get it. You had a really strong redistricting reform bill passed in New Hampshire out of the legislature. The governor vetoed it there, and they narrowly failed to override the veto. There are really strong potentials for redistricting reform in Pennsylvania. It hasn't quite come together. Pennsylvania is one of these states where leadership controls a lot of things, and they haven't quite managed to, get around that. But there's bipartisan support. And in Virginia, the legislature passed, a very good, if not fully independent, redistricting reform that I think that voters will vote on November 3rd, and that's because lawmakers increasingly understand that this is important to voters, and they also think that sometimes their power grabs have created problems, and they'll tell you this off the record. At a bar near the state capitol, back when you could go to bars near the state capitol, they'll tell you like, gosh, we were a little greedy, and we ended up getting all these crazy people in there, and we were better off when we had a narrower majority because we weren't like under pressure to pass all this extreme legislation because we could always say like we just don't have the votes, but now we have the votes and people are expecting us to do this. Now, so that's the good news. The bad news, of course, is that ballot initiatives, which have been the principal way that these reforms have occurred, are available only in about half the states. And so, and even though lawmakers are increasingly getting it, they're not necessarily doing the strongest version of these reforms. And in some places, like Texas, they're unlikely to do it, period. But here too is an area where Congress could act, and it could do so by because the elections clause of the Constitution gives states the power to set the time, place, and manner of federal elections, and that includes the district's boundaries for Congress. But Congress has the power to override those and to create uniform rules. And so Congress has the power to do that in the redistricting space. And HR 1, which was passed the US House in 2019, it's been stalled in the Senate, would mandate all states use independent commissions to draw maps, and it would create a uniform set of rules for doing so. Surprisingly for congressional redistricting, there aren't many rules in most states, and the rules that are there you could drive a truck through. So it would have stricter rules about protecting communities of color, keeping communities together, not splitting up towns and cities. And it would create a statutory ban on partisan gerrymandering, and so that's something that Congress could do. Now it has gone nowhere in this Congress because the leadership of the Senate doesn't want it to go anywhere. But in a different world where there's a different Congress, that could be a priority. And Speaker Pelosi has said that it's a priority for the next Congress should Democrats be in the majority. In addition to that, Congress could do a number of other really useful things like update protections for communities of color because they're pretty frayed. The Supreme Court struck down the provision that used to require most Southern states and a few jurisdictions outside of the South to get their redistricting plans pre-approved before they went into effect. They struck down the formula for that, saying the formula was used evidence that was too outdated. But Congress could pass a new formula that sort of looks at whether there are voting rights violations or problems in that are more contemporary than the old formula looked at. And Congress also could create formulas that work better for Latinos and Asians, who are two of the fastest growing groups in the country and have not been able to successfully use the Voting Rights Act that much, in part because the Voting Rights Act was written for a black and white world, literally a black and white world. So the drafters of the Voting Rights Act looked at why African Americans weren't successful electorally and wrote a law to remedy that. But why Latinos and Asians aren't successful electorally is sometimes similar, but oftentimes very different. And there really isn't a legal remedy for that. And that's something that Congress also could do. And that would be important to help ensure John Adams' vision that our Congress and that legislature should be an exact portrait, a miniature of the people as a whole, in all of the dimensions. And so, so that's something that is coming up. And redistricting, again, will start in the summer of next year and run through early 2022. So there will inevitably be a lot of litigation around it because that's something that we do in America as we litigate, like elections, we litigate district boundaries. But that's something that, people should watch for and, get involved with in your communities, because it will actually determine political power for the course of the whole of a decade. Now I want to turn to the subject of voter suppression, because that's something that I think has been much in the news. And here I think it's important to do some table setting at the outset, because the hard truth is, as much as we like to think of ourselves as a model democracy, a beacon for the world, as some people like to say, the reality is that a lot of our election infrastructure is pretty outdated. And when you hear voter suppression, and when you hear about problems that have occurred or that will occur on election day, I think a reality check is that a lot of it is just a system that has suffered from benign neglect and chronic underfunding, and that system just cannot handle the world that we live in today. And a great example of that is the state where I live now, New York. It is really, really hard to vote in New York. Up until recently, New York had no early voting. And the early voting it has right now is very limited. In Texas, where I used to live, you can vote anywhere in your county. You can go to, if I lived in Houston, I could go to any of 122 early voting locations and vote. In New York and Brooklyn, where I live now, I have to go to one very specific early voting place to vote and wait for 2 hours in line to be able to do that, because they don't have enough machines. And so That's an example of something that, is in some ways deliberate, but in some ways is just, that we as a country haven't funded robust infrastructure. We already talked about how hard it is to register to vote. In Texas, that's another example of, something that, I think that, we just haven't, in many places, people just have not updated laws, even though everyone recognizes that they could. And, both red states, some states, both red and blue, have done a good job of this, and other states have not. So, and on this front, it's worth noting that much of the technology we use for voting is like remarkably outdated. We at the Brennan Center did a report a couple of years ago about how outdated the technology was. And there's great examples about how some of the voting machines that you use in states, people have to program them using those old hard floppy disks. I guess they're not really floppy, but they're the sort of hard versions that you stick in and it kind of goes bang, 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 and runs it, and then you pop it out and you stick another one in there, and that's how they actually program machines. And election officials will say, like, gosh, we go on eBay to try to find those disks because the ones that we have like worn out, and we need to get new ones, and we can't find enough of these disks, so we go to eBay to try to buy them. And all of this causes breakdowns and problems. And so when you hear about voter suppression, I think it's important to separate out what is election administration failure, and what is sort of more deliberate in all of this. And so, it's a caveat, of course, people love to be outraged on social media, like this is voter suppression. And sometimes it is, but oftentimes it's more, the result of we simply don't pay enough attention to elections. And I want to contrast that to like a place like Taiwan, which in 2018 held elections, and in many parts of the island, people had to wait over an hour to vote. And the reaction of the government, well, first of all, the head of elections resigned to accept responsibility for that. And the government's reaction was to add over 1,700 polling places for upcoming elections. Here, by contrast, when I voted in Brooklyn last Sunday, people were waiting for 2-hour lines or 2.5-hour lines, and people were tweeting like, "This is what democracy looks like," and it's like, no, this is actually not what democracy is supposed to look like. This is not, we shouldn't be proud of the fact that we have a broken system. So, with all of that, again, this election won't be perfect, but no election is perfect. The good news is that, even where you have these election failures, people, there are good people who are, they're getting solved, right? So, in Brooklyn, where I live, lots of people requested mail ballots this year because of the COVID pandemic. But lots of people got mail ballots with the wrong outside protection envelope, right? You fill out your ballot and then you stick it in an envelope and you sign the envelope, and the envelope has a sticker with your name and address on there. But the problem was, I could get an envelope that said Joe Smith, from three doors down. And if I signed it and sent it back in with that envelope that said Joe Smith, they would look at it and say, this signature doesn't match. This isn't Joe Smith, and like toss the ballot, right? And so, and 100,000 people potentially had that problem. But the good news is that people recognize they had the problem, and election officials went out of their way to try to solve the problem. Contacting, hand delivering, and doing things like that, because the reality is that most of the people who are involved with their elections, the people who staff polling places, the people who run election offices, they may be underfunded, they may be using outdated equipment, but they are very conscientious about what they do, and they take the job really seriously. And for all the talk that we've had about like people trying to steal the election or do this or that, the reality is that you're going to run head on into a lot of these like very conscientious people. So that there will be problems, but most of the problems are solvable, and we should want, and most of the votes will count. Now, having said, that people should not necessarily hyperventilate, I do want to talk about three trends that I think are worrying. And one is a blatant effort to stop election officials from making it easier for people to vote. And this is really quite shocking. And two examples, in Harris County, Texas, they allowed people to vote while sitting in their cars. They had drive-through voting. You drove under this tent and they gave you this tablet and you voted and then you drove out. And Republican elected officials in Harris County, Texas, which is home to Houston, sued to try to have over 100,000 ballots invalidated because they said the Texas law doesn't allow you to vote in your car. And it's unclear, why that's a particular problem. But they say you can only vote in your car if you're disabled. Another example is Alabama has, if you vote by mail, you have to get a witness. And a court waived the witness requirement, but it got reinstated, but by a higher court, but only after many people already got their mail ballots with instructions saying you don't need to have a witness. And so counties in Alabama are desperately trying to go out and call people and say I know it says on a very official looking form that you don't need a witness, but you actually do. And that's potentially really disenfranchising, and the justification for it is really intellectually incoherent. If voters have acted in good faith and relied on what they were told by election officials, there should be a strong and almost unbreakable presumption that your vote will count. But instead, there seems to be an active, fairly partisan effort to disenfranchise voters. And the second thing that's disturbing is related to that, which is the willingness of courts to go along with this. We're 4 days away from a national election, and in many states, we actually don't know what all the rules are. When your ballot has to get there in order to count, and many other features of the election. 4 days away from the election, we actually don't know all the rules yet, and that's unprecedented, in some ways, very alarming. And I'll add to that a third worrying thing, which I've already alluded to, which is that many of the people that we elect to take care of these things, not the election administrators themselves, who I think by and large are the salt of the earth, but many of our elected officials seem to have no interest in doing anything. Congress had an opportunity to pass election funding. They passed $400 million, but people have estimated that you really need to make voting safe for people, upwards of $3 or $4 billion, and they passed no additional funding to enable states to run elections. And in fact, some people actually sort of, seem to be taking glee in this. Senator Mike Lee of Utah, who's no relation to me, tweeted earlier this month that democracy isn't our country's aim. And he said that sometimes, quote unquote, what he called, quote unquote, rank democracy was a hindrance to the actual aims of the country. And those sorts of statements would have been unprecedented not so long ago from people who hold high office in our government. And regardless of where you stand politically, I think it's not too much to ask that our elected officials actually think that democracy is a good thing and that we should operate in that we should have high state capacity in actually delivering on, things like, how we run elections. So those are sort of worrying trends, because I do think, there are a lot of good people out there. There are increasing number of people, elected officials, and to some extent, perhaps even the courts, who are willing to sort of engage in gamesmanship, or at least very disingenuous thinking about elections. And that's worrying as we go into the future. That said, I will end by saying, I think, my sense is that this election will go very well. And I think the biggest reason to be hopeful simply are the American people. Senator Mike Lee may not believe in democracy, but the American people do, and at a very granular and basic level. We've seen that already with the massive turnout. Over 88 million people have already voted, a third of the country. In Texas, the voter turnout is already over 50%, probably 55% at when polls close today. And people, with all the turmoil of the last few years, people by and large have, they did not, regardless of where you are, people have not resorted to violence. They haven't resorted to, even massive protest. What they've done is they've organized, they've turned out to in droves. They've registered to vote. They've registered others to vote. They signed up to run for office. And the fact that Americans, despite it all, believe in democracy and the democratic process, that alone may be our saving grace. And the other reason I think I'm, looking a little bit beyond that, the reason I would say that I'm confident about our future is that, I think we are due for a democracy moment. We know from American history that reform oftentimes comes in waves. And depending on what happens this November, we could be again in a once in a generation, perhaps in a once in a multi-generation opportunity to give our democracy a good remodel. And particularly because we know that those waves, waves don't last forever. They can oftentimes be really short. And so, I hope that everyone out there, uses this moment to think big, because we don't just need to touch up on our democracy. We need a full gut renovation in some ways, right? For some of the reasons we've talked about and more. And a good place to start is a recognition that there's no right to vote in federal law. There are a few limits. You can't discriminate on the basis of age, sex, or race, but there's no overall right to vote. And that's in contrast to other countries like South Africa, which have an express right to vote in their constitutions. That would be a good place to start. Likewise, there's the oversight of elections, which has been mostly left to states, and that's been good, overall. But some federal oversight would be good. Again, as we discussed, there have been wildly different procedures in places like New York and North Carolina and Texas. And particularly if we're going to move to a national popular vote for president, I do think that some greater uniformity is good. And then there's a full package of reforms. I mentioned HR 1 earlier in the context of redistricting, but there's a whole host of reforms that are embedded in HR 1. It's a big package of democracy reforms, ranging from automatic voter registration, uniform, we would have uniform early voting, or at least minimum early voting in every state in the country. We would have small dollar public financing. All of those are things that we can do. And so we shouldn't be bound by the past. We should recognize where we are in the challenges, and we should think boldly, because it's rare that you have these moments. And we are lucky enough to be living in a very historical moment, and it's up to us to be bold. And so with that, I think I'm at time, and I will stop and let somebody tell me what the next steps are.
Tommy, what'd you think?
Well, I thought it was outstanding, Professor Lee. That was, you've given us so much to think about. Let me, we've got some great questions in the chat, by the way. Sue and Dee and Maria and Chris and Peg and everyone, I see you. But I want to start with this because it's just been bothering me. And that is, I think the argument for the Electoral College and the way that we elect senators and so forth is the way that we amend the Constitution, for Pete's sakes, where we give states, we elevate the status of states and their roles in those things over seemingly individuals. So state equality seemingly is stressed more than individual equality in many of those schemes. We can talk specifics. Lemming and I just got through talking specifics with a group of high school kids, but I think the argument would go something like this, and other teachers that are on here, let me know if you can think of better arguments. But the argument would go something like, hey, states were important players in our system of government. At the time of the founding, at the time of the framing, when we first made this agreement, we knew that states were going to be powerful. We wanted states to be powerful. We only wanted to give, Congress 17 specific power and an 18th to do whatever was necessary and proper. So it's baked into the system, like it or not. State equality is baked into the system. It's a part of our DNA. And federalism, this just in, federalism is going nowhere anytime soon. And so the argument would be, yeah, we leave some things up to the states, and we do stress state equality, as in representation in the Senate and how we elect a president. Although you didn't think that it was as big a problem, that representation question wasn't as big of a problem as the, which states are kind of, balancing the whole thing. But what would you say to those, that kind of federalism and original contract that we signed up for through the Constitution?
Well, there's no question probably that we would, if we were the Constitutional Convention, we would probably, with all of our history, right, if we were charged with drafting a new constitution, we would probably start with, a draft that looked very different than the one that the framers came up with, at least with regard to how we elect the president, right? Like electing the president through states seems very anathema to people, right? When they think about it, my vote doesn't count. I lived in Texas for many years when, it was a very reliably Republican state. And if I wanted to vote Democratic, my vote didn't count. And, likewise, regardless of what party you support, you can live in a state where your vote doesn't count. And that seems really anathema. In the Senate, you're absolutely right. Like, the Senate has some like really anti-democratic features, namely the fact that every state gets 2 senators, and the difference in the size of states at the time for the original 13 was much smaller than the difference between South Dakota and California, right? I mean, I'm not sure if people have seen the famous meme of where if you divide Manhattan around 57th Street, so just north of Trump Tower, the northern part of the island of Manhattan has about the population of North Dakota, and the southern part of the island of Manhattan has about the population of South Dakota, right? And but those are only, and so it seems like really unfair that those 2 states get 4 senators, and Manhattan shares 2 senators with the rest of New York, which is a state with like 20 million people, right? And so, so I think certainly we would probably do it differently. I think the idea behind it was that states were sort of like important. They were a form of community, right? And that we should give some recognition to like, the fact that like districts couldn't encompass all like types of communities and things like that. And so we should also have a body that had states. But in the modern thinking, of course, we also belong to other sorts of communities, right? We belong to racial and ethnic communities. We belong to like class communities. We belong to lots of different kinds of communities. And so in other countries, they have like a mixed system where one house is elected by districts and one house is elected proportionally, right? So you could have, if you did that, you might have like more African Americans, right, or more gay people in one house, or more religious conservatives, or whatever the case may be, because people could vote along other sorts of communal lines. That's but of course, doing all of that would either require having another constitutional convention or amending the current constitution, so we're sort of stuck with where we are today. But I think the good news is that at least on the Electoral College, there is a fix, right? There is a fix that just requires convincing people. some of the other things I think are harder, right? The Senate is going to be a particularly hard problem because we're just, a little over a decade away from, 80% of the population living in 10 states, which is to say that 80% of the population will be represented by 20% of the Senate, or conversely, that 20% of the population will control 80% of the Senate, right? And that's sort of untenable. Like that's like deeply undemocratic. How you get past that is a little unclear. Other than perhaps wildly dividing states up, like admitting DC as like 7 states or something like that to sort of balance things out. But the design of the Senate is obviously one that they could have thought things through a little bit more. So, and it's interesting. Like we oftentimes have a lot of reverence for the framers, and I love I have like a bunch right behind me of American founding era history, but it's important to recognize that they didn't get everything sort of right. Like they didn't think through everything. The Constitution has if there's in case of a tie in the Electoral College, the House decides who the president is, and every state gets 1 vote. But the framers, in their infinite wisdom, never considered that a state might have an even number of representatives in the House. And what do you do if the representatives themselves are tied, right? They never actually decided what you do. Like if Pennsylvania's delegation is split 9-9, and they can't decide, do you just not count Pennsylvania? Like, do they get up and say I abstain? So like clearly the framers didn't know everything. So.
But that's another example, though, right? I mean, the way it was taught to me was they envisioned a system of electing a president where we oftentimes would not have a majority in the Electoral College. They envisioned that it would oftentimes be decided in the House of Representatives, and that's in my estimation, another tip of the cap from the founders' perspective to their vision of state equality and state sovereignty, really, in this system of government. And again, that flies contemporarily. It flies in the face of kind of 1 person, 1 vote, and kind of equal justice for all of us, and equal representation for all of us. But I'm just trying to play a little bit devil's advocate here and just think of, this is our system, and we don't really question it that much. And so what are the really good reasons for electing senators the way that we do, or electing a president the way that we do? And I think your response, honestly, has been that we do it that way because that's the way they said we should do it, and they were limited in their capacity of kind of understanding modern day democracy and representation, and who gets to participate, and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, they to the point, like the framer, like their limited vision, like the one great thing that they didn't see, and you're absolutely correct. They thought that there would be a lot more disputed elections, right? But the one thing that they didn't actually see is that we would have political parties, right? And we have political parties like very shortly after the country is founding, but they somehow thought like, oh, well, we will not have factions, right? But it's like, whoa, that was like a big miss, right?
Absolutely.
Bobby. Yeah, this comes from Chris Kavanaugh. You had a very interesting discussion about the technical aspect of all this, and we're kind of behind, talking about hanging chads a number of years ago. The technology of voting and the machinery that we use is somewhat archaic and problematic. This question deals with not foreign influence by using social media, but foreign influence into getting into our voting system. Do you see any threat there?
I think that most of the systems are secure enough because very few of them are actually connected to the internet, right? They're sort of like, and that's sort of like they're, I mean, the good news is like, some of our voting systems predate like the widespread use of Wi-Fi and things like that, and so it can be very hard to do. And I think as we move and we buy the next generation, I mean, that's why a lot of people have advocated that, really like cities and counties don't have the money to buy
Right.
like really secure information machines, and as these machines die out, and many of them are already past their expected lifetime, right? I mean, if you can imagine using like the kind of phone or something that you used, or the kind of Palm Pilot that you used in 2000, and you're still somehow using it, um, as we replace it, we need to like buy state of the art, like really secure machinery, and Congress needs to step in and fund that, because it is a concern. It's not one that I think is a concern necessarily given the way, what we use right now, but it is a concern potentially
For the future.
in the future. Yeah.
One of the questions, it's kind of funny how things change so quickly. 4 years ago, we would have been asking students, should the US, like Australia, fine people for not voting because of low voter turnout? Now with this election, that might be a moot question. I mean, we may have break all kinds of records, which would be a good thing. But just in a sense of that question, as you've seen around the world, different countries doing different things in terms of voting. What's your thoughts on mandatory voting?
Well, that's an interesting question, and it's one that's quite contentious. It has worked for Australia fine. I think in the US there are at least some concern, setting aside, there are certainly people who don't want lots of people to vote, right? And they kind of assume that the people who aren't voting would vote against them because the people who don't vote tend to be younger and less affluent and whatnot, and therefore people presume more democratic, right? So whether that's true or not, but I even in the civil rights community, sometimes you hear concerns about like the last thing we need is another sort of criminal sanction, right? Like there are enough laws that get enforced disproportionately against communities of color that the last thing we want to do is to sort of like create something else that you get arrested for because somehow you didn't, you had this fine because you didn't vote in 3 elections, and then you didn't pay the fine, so now there's a warrant out for your arrest, and like you get stopped and you get arrested for that and put in jail and all of that. So there's a lot that which I think we should think about that, because it might be a good idea, but we should start probably just by making it easier for people to vote, right? And one of the big reasons why people don't vote, I used to do election work. I one time when I was working for a candidate, I called up, can candidate X count on your support? And the woman said, like, can you tell me how to vote? And it's like, oh, well, like, candidate X wants to do belong. It's like, no, tell me, like, how do I vote? Like, where do I go? What do I bring? What, all of this stuff is not sort of readily available. And some states do it better than others. California, you get an information packet, right? If you live in California, it's sent to every voter. In Texas, you get nothing, right? Other than maybe a card in the mail. And so, but if I were just, a few hundred miles north in Canada, like you would go, like there's automatic voter registration. Everybody, using government records, you're on the roll. And if somehow you just moved into an area, no problem. You go there on election day, you show them your lease, that you signed a lease, and they're like, okay, we'll add you to the roll. Here's your ballot, go vote. And we don't do that. We make it exceptionally hard. And that's something that's really perplexing to people. I was just talking yesterday to a reporter from Europe who said, like, can you explain to me like why you register to vote in the US? Because like we don't have that here. We just go to the polling place and our name is on the list. And it's like, yeah, let me try to explain. It's really hard. I mean, we could make it easier. We could have early voting. We could, send out information packets. We could do automatic voter registration. And I think,
isn't one of the, sorry to interrupt, but isn't one of the, we have so much to get to here. Isn't one of the reasons why, or at least one of the arguments that people pose is the idea of voter fraud. They say we need all these regulations and so forth because of potential voter fraud, and it just makes me wonder. Can you, you're an expert on voting and elections. Is there ever can you point to a time or an instance of just widespread voter fraud in the United States where we say, well, geez, we were just way too easy with our voting regulations, and look what happened. Oh my, I mean, everybody went afoul, and there were, thousands and thousands of fraudulent votes. Any examples like that?
No, not really. I mean, it's so hard to pull off voter fraud, right? And particularly the kind that they talk about, well, just like in-person impersonation, right? Where somebody comes in and I pretend like I'm you or something like that, and I vote, right? You know, that's hard to do. Because first of all, I don't know if you're going to come and vote, but let's assume that somehow I knew that you probably wouldn't, and I went in and voted. But there's still only one vote, right? I'd have to like figure out a way to do that like tens or hundreds of thousands of times in order to sway an election, and like that's just like really complicated and hard to do. And you'd have to get people to volunteer, and they'd have to like like because I couldn't go and leave and come back as somebody else, right? Because they would recognize that, right? And the good news is that there really are so many security checks that prevent voter fraud. In Colorado, there was this guy who was with one of these, I think a QAnon associated group, and he was like so convinced that there was going to be voter fraud that he signed up to be a poll worker because like I'm going to prevent voter fraud, right? And he had tweeted on Twitter like like, gosh, I found out it's actually kind of hard to do, right? At least in Colorado. And the reality is it's not only hard to do in Colorado, it's hard to do almost anywhere, right? Because there's so many checks, and like they're and whether you vote in person or vote by mail, it is really hard to do. And which is not to say that there aren't incidents of it, but it's like so rare. You're more likely statistically to be struck by lightning than
Sure.
to commit voter fraud, and it just doesn't happen. It's really just an excuse looking for to justify bad acts.
Let's just real quick turn our attention to gerrymandering, which is actually a topic that I even taught about 25 years ago. I mean, it makes its way into civics and history textbooks. But it does seem, and let's combine it with the technology stuff that you were talking about, that we're kind of behind the times in terms of our election technology. But, it seems to me that if we could use technology to gerrymander in a particular way, right, to district in a way that favors us, we should also be able to use technology to ensure that we don't. In other words, create some sort of formula that.
It's called an algorithm, Tommy.
Yeah, algorithm. Thanks, Bob. Algorithm, formula, some sort of algorithm to ensure that we don't have that, right? I mean, would that be possible?
Well, you certainly can easily measure maps to see whether they're sort of outliers or something like that, right? We're not yet to the point where we can draw perfect maps that do the things that because they're literally they're literally are dozens, hundreds of choices when you're drawing a map. Do you draw the line on Smith Street, or do you draw it like 2 streets over and then move something else, right? And so it's hard to make for a computer to make those sorts of choices, but it is possible to like have a reasonable set of maps from a partisan bias standpoint. Increasingly, you're able to do this for like to ensure that you comply with the Voting Rights Act and you fairly treat communities of color. And you can say, okay, we came up with these 600 possible maps. We're going to choose from among these 600 maps. We may tweak them a little bit here or there because we all of the maps split Smithville, and Smithville really thinks it's really important that it needs to be kept together, and we kind of buy that, right? And so that's an example of how you might use technology. But certainly technology can identify outliers. If you draw a map and it's like, whoa, it's way out here in terms of like its partisan fairness, it can flag that for you and say like, this is out of bounds, right? But it can't, even if it doesn't sort of do the ultimate. And the example I always use in terms of like something that a computer can't do, in California, there is a legislative assembly district that is drawn in the LA foothills. And it keeps a bunch of communities together, and they're very different. Some are like middle class, some are like very rich, and really everybody who lives in there, you can't drive through all the foothills, while staying in the foothills. You have to go down into the valley, then drive back up, and people drive into the valley to go to work, go to school, shop. And it would be reasonable to have like districts that include the parts of the foothills and parts of the valley. But the people in the foothills said, we want to be in one district because we have one big problem that nobody pays attention to in Sacramento, and that's wildfires. And we want to be in one district because we think that we'll get attention. And the California Commission, when they drew the map, decided, that's a pretty good reason. And we're going to put them all in a district. And guess what? The next election, Democrats ran, Republicans ran, and everybody was talking about wildfires, prevention, funding, all of that. And so that's an example of something that a computer can't quite yet do. But the commission, because you had a fair map drawing process, they were able to like take that evidence into account and make that decision.
We have a couple of additional
ahead,
questions on gerrymandering, and I'll try to combine the two. And they have to do with the Supreme Court being reluctant to rule on these cases because of kind of the political questions doctrine. And so the question is, do you see increased activities at the state court level, like the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's ruling? If so, in what states do you expect to see these suits, or will we have to wait until after the remapping of 2021?
So I do think that there will be more action in state courts. Some of that will depend on, well, I will say, like, I think state constitutional tradition is something that we've long ignored. State constitutions oftentimes are very robust. They're amended a lot more. Some of them, they're oftentimes more recent than the federal constitution. And so, they, and even if they aren't that recent, they go through waves of amendment in the progressive era and the New Deal era in the 1960s and 70s, right? And so they oftentimes have very robust protections that I think that we haven't mined enough. I think, a lot of that would depend on the quality of state courts, of course, and their willingness to enforce that. And that's better in some areas than others. But I do think that people will increasingly look to state courts because the federal courts are out of bounds, at least for now, in terms of partisan gerrymandering. What states, I think some of that will depend on what happens on November 3rd, 4 days. Because the biggest predictor of having bad maps is having one party in control of the process, right? Where you have divided government, the maps end up fair. They don't end up perfect, but they end up fairer because, like Democrats aren't going to pass a map that like screws them, right? And vice versa. And so, there are places where you could end up with split control. And in fact, some of the states where you had really bad maps last time was like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, you actually do have split control now. You have a Democratic governor in Wisconsin who could veto bad maps, same thing in Pennsylvania. And so, the elections actually may, set the table for that and determine where people need to litigate. But I would suspect that many of the worst maps in the country will be in the South, in part because there's racially polarized voting. The South has been the fastest growing part of the country. Half the country's population growth is in the South, and because there is split single party control by a party that does not win the support right now of communities of color, and so there's a lot of potential for disadvantaging community of color there.
Tommy, we probably have a chance for one more. Is there something that's come out of the chat that we haven't gotten to?
Oh, there's always issues when it comes to voting and elections. What about, it was mentioned by a previous scholar that it might be helpful if we had a 28th Amendment that affirmatively, positively guarantees the right to vote. And do you agree or disagree with that? By the way, you look it up on Google, and there are people proposing, talking about in the New York Times and so forth, 28th Amendment. So if you agree that that would be a good idea, why would that be a good idea in terms of the current state of our elections and voting and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I think it would be an absolutely great idea. It's something that many countries who have drafted constitutions more recently than ours have put in there, right? I mean, our constitution was drafted at a time when the framers didn't think, it never occurred to them that everyone, not even all white males, would vote, right? I mean, they it never occurred to them that like you would have like even all white males voting, and much less everyone. And so, that's another thing where, other constitutions that were written more recently are more up to date. Um, I suspect, that it would run into some of the problems which you flagged earlier, which is that you have to get this thing passed. Not only get it passed through the Senate, but also passed by the states. And many people will put on their political hat and say, does this help my party or not? And if it does, I'll vote for it. And if not, I will vote against it. And so that's one of the challenges of, doing that. Because even if you can get rid of the filibuster, but you can't get rid of the constitutional requirement that you get more super majority of states in order to pass a constitutional amendment. So it's a great idea, and I hope that there's work done building the coalition for that, because it is sort of really basic, and there is sort of a war on voting right now, seemingly not only from elected officials, but sometimes by judges, right? And that's something that's very disturbing, and I think that could play a big role in that.
Last question. This election that's happening in 4 days, and you follow this as closely, more closely than almost anyone. If we have a close electoral college vote election, what are the chances of an extended contested election, and how extended, if it is close in the Electoral College, no matter which party wins, how extended could this election be before we finally are able to recognize a winner?
So, that's a scenario that I think a lot of people spend a lot of time worrying about earlier in the year. It doesn't, it still is possible, but at least at the moment, it seems less likely than likely. But if, there are strict deadlines in law about when things have to be done. And as many people might remember, in 2000, it was those strict deadlines that sort of forced like decisions, because the Electoral College has to vote in early December. The votes have to be opened in the House in the new Congress in early January, and then the new president has to take office at noon on January 20th if there is a new president. And so, all of the issues will get resolved in order to meet those hard and fast deadlines, and the most important of which is January 20th. But that doesn't.
Is there any scenario in which those deadlines are pushed back or could be pushed back by someone? The court?
Yes, by Congress. Congress could push back at least sort of like the county deadlines and things like that. And when the votes are open to things like that, Congress cannot push back the fact that the president's term expires at noon on January 20th. And so,
how about the Electoral College voting date?
That is set by statute, so that could be moved, but it would require both houses of the current Congress to agree to that. And if they don't agree, then it is what it is, as Dr. Fauci would say, or the president, I guess, also said that. So
Okay.
you know,
All right.
you know, there's again, like that is an area where, like, I think a lot of people were like, when we thought like that was more likely, it was another one of those areas where it was like, gosh, the framers didn't think through all of this like really clearly, because it's kind of messy and ambiguous, right? It's sort of another one of those areas, but fortunately it doesn't look like we will actually have to put that to the test. But I suppose we could, in which case I'll come back and do a follow-up.
Oh, I would love it. I'd say I've really, really enjoyed the entire, if they could unmute themselves, I'm sure our participants would thank you as well. That was really, really super well done. And you really gave us lots of stuff to think about. And, it was just a nice package of stuff, a little contemporary, a little historical, a little constitutional, a little philosophical. So who
A little
knew?
wide-ranging, right? I mean, there's so much going on that there's so much to talk about. Yeah.
Who knew voting in elections could be so exciting? Gerrymandering. Yes, we found a way to make that interesting, or you did. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Thank you so much. And we have come up on our time, everyone, but just a few quick words. I want to thank our sponsors, first of all, the Center for Civic Education, Kansas State University, the Johnson County First Amendment Foundation, and the Indiana Bar Foundation. Thank you so much to our sponsors. Once again, it's all thanks to you that we can have this event at all in the first place. And with that, I will say good night, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much, Professor Lee.
Yeah, go
Thanks,
vote.
Professor Lee. It was great.
Go vote. That's right. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.